Tighnari is one of the very first people we meet in Sumeru, and while it's not obvious, he is a titan of the academic world. He was once a student of the Sumeru Akademiya and had great prospects as part of the Amurta Darshan. He was a smart student that was diligent in his research, but eventually he would let it all go. So given his bright future, why did he choose to leave the Akademiya and instead pursue a life as a forest watcher? Before we get into that, if you are interested in more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Tighnari during his time in the Akademiya was part of the Amurta Darshan, a department of the Akademiya that focused on studying biology. Under the Amurta Darshan, Tighnari pursued the field of botany, the study of plants and anything relating to them. He was a pretty promising student and had the respect of most in his field who viewed him as a reliable source of information, especially in his area of study. Most of his time was spent in the Pardis Di, an off-site research area used by the Amurta Darshan. He would often conduct his studies here, and with his location being far from the Akademiya, visitors to the location were few and far between. Tighnari was knowledgeable enough in his field to even be consulted by Kaveh, a renowned architect, to advise him on suitable plants to be grown on a project he was working on. There are many other examples of Tighnari's expertise in his field which we will touch on a bit later, but suffice to say he was a pretty talented botanist. His intellect and expertise in this field is also what inadvertently led him to obtaining his vision. During one of the Akademiya's numerous conferences Tighnari had to attend, he noticed a mistake in a fellow researcher's work. While at first hesitant, he eventually raised his hand and corrected the researcher mid-presentation. While it was tense at first, it led to others chiming in as well, which overall led to a happier ending as the researcher was able to significantly improve their work. As Tighnari sat down, he noticed something fall out of his pocket, and to his surprise, it was a vision. Obviously, he was happy with this outcome, having wanted a dendro vision since he was young. Although he really only wanted one so he could summon vines to get fruit from high places. But I'm sure his priorities have since changed. It's not explicitly mentioned why this experience or scenario led to him receiving a vision, but it is speculated that it might be due to his contributions to the field, or perhaps it's his ambition to share knowledge. Now, while the story I've shared so far might seem to depict a positive experience for Tighnari in the Akademiya, he would eventually decide to leave all of it for something else. Despite having a potentially bright future as a researcher, Tighnari decided that the Akademiya no longer upheld the right ethics in the world of academics. He would ultimately leave the Akademiya to find his own way and eventually join the Forest Watchers. There are two primary reasons why he decided to leave. Firstly is related to the study of mechanical life. In his story event, Tighnari shares with the traveler the reason why such a subject is now banned in the Akademiya. A long time ago, the study of mechanical life was a rather popular subject among its scholars. Eventually though, ambition overtook ethics. You see, the scholars began to fantasize about what such mechanical life could bring to them. Perhaps you could have them go into dangerous areas, do mundane work nobody wants to do, and even become their servants. In pursuit of such knowledge, the scholars threw away any semblance of humanity and ruthlessly chased after a way to create mechanical life. This caused many to be extremely cruel to pretty much any biological life form, like animals, in an attempt to bridge the knowledge gap between biological life and mechanical. Most scholars saw their own lives as more important than the lives of other living creatures, and in so doing, lost respect for what life generally meant. This is what Tighnari despises, as in his own words, what do you expect to get from researching something as pure as life with impure intentions? He felt that the scholars had been too concerned with whether they could, instead of thinking about whether they should, and threw out all the rules and ethics along with everything else just to achieve this one goal. What annoys Tighnari even more is that, considering how significant such a discovery would be, he suspects the banning of this area of study as nothing more than a show by the Akademiya, and that eventually it will be open for research once more. The second reason why he left has to do with how the Akademiya hoards knowledge. To Tighnari, knowledge goes beyond just knowing something. It is an essential tool for survival. But this goes against the practices of the Akademiya, who believe that knowledge should instead be carefully controlled, and the public should only know a select group of things, decided by them of course. It is also this reason that he decided to join the Forest Watchers and teach them all he knows about the forest and how to survive. He feels that talking about ideas in classrooms without actually taking action is a bit of a waste of time. So with all these differences Tighnari has had with the scholars of the Akademiya, you would think that the Akademiya would want nothing more to do with him, right? Well, as we see in the main story, the Akademiya actually made quite an effort to bring him back to research work. In fact, they first had his master, the Sage of Amurta, send him a letter, and when that didn't convince him, the Sage of the Haravatat Darshan himself came personally. Sage being the second highest ranking position in the Akademiya, second only to the Grand Sage, speaks volumes of how highly they regarded Tighnari, especially on matters in his field. Now, when we overheard this conversation for the first time, the sage and other scholars accompanying him mentions that they would need his expertise in reversing the effects of the withering on the Irminsul. Tighnari, having experience in both botany and dealing with the withering as part of the Forest Watchers, made this request pretty reasonable, at least on the surface. But as we find out much later, the Akademiya is actually working on a secret project, one that involved cultivating a new god. Now, I'm not sure what exactly Tighnari could have contributed to this project, but having two sages attempt at drawing him back to the Akademiya, he must have been quite instrumental. I think that perhaps Tighnari was the last part of this project. Once they had the god that they could control up and running, maybe then they would tackle the Irminsul problem. But since Tighnari turned both of them down, we might never know the full story. Tighnari continues to lead the forest rangers and guide those who needs his help most. I suppose he views his work as worthwhile, even if it's to help one person, one animal, or one plant at a time, and is perfectly content with his current situation. He has assisted the traveler several times throughout the story, and I have no doubt that when the final confrontation with the Akademiya takes place, Tighnari will be an invaluable ally. Perhaps when the dust settles and the sages are brought to justice for what they've done, he might actually go back to the Akademiya. Only this time perhaps as a sage. But that does it for this video. If you enjoyed it, do consider subscribing to the channel and I'll see you in the next one. As usual, I hope you have a good day tomorrow.